My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the arm of the chair just to stay upright. The attorney's office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of place where voices usually stayed low out of respect. That morning, respect felt optional. My sister Brooke sat across from me, calm and polished in a navy blazer. Her legs crossed, her posture steady. She looked exactly how everyone expected a grieving daughter to look. I looked like a liability. I was 31 years old, and my body had been failing me in quiet, humiliating ways for months. An autoimmune condition I'd managed carefully for years had flared after I came home to Raleigh to help with our father's final weeks. Fatigue, dizziness, joints that refused to cooperate. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just enough to make standing for too long feel like a gamble. Brooke leaned slightly toward our mother Diane and spoke softly, but not softly enough. "She's been like this for weeks," she said. One thing after another. Doctors' excuses. I told her stress would make it worse, especially with the inheritance situation. I felt the heat rise in my face. Inheritance. She said it the way people say addiction or scandal. Something ugly you don't argue with in public. My mother didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if the answer might be written there. A couple of relatives shifted in their chairs. I recognized the look on their faces. Concern mixed with doubt. The kind that settles in when a story has already been told without you in the room. Lauren's always had. Episodes, Brooke continued, her voice steady, reasonable. And with everything Dad's left, I think it's important we're honest about what's really going on. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the effort of holding myself together. I could feel the familiar weakness creeping into my legs. I hated that it was happening here of all places. I hated that it made her sound right. Michael Grant, my father's attorney, cleared his throat. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the patient expression of someone who had seen families fracture before. Before we proceed with the reading of Thomas Hayes's will, he said there's a procedural matter we need to address. Brooke frowned just slightly. What kind of matter? Grant hesitated, then glanced toward the door, one involving records and identity. The door opened quietly. A uniformed police officer stepped in first, followed by a man in a dark jacket who moved with the confidence of someone used to uncomfortable rooms. He took out a badge and held it up. "Detective Alan Ruiz," he said. "Miss Lauren Hayes." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. "We're not here about the will," Ruiz continued. "We're here because a complaint filed earlier this month has reached a point where we need to ask some questions. Today seemed like the appropriate time." The room went very still. Brooke laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "This is ridiculous. She's clearly unwell." Detective Ruiz didn't look at her. He was watching me, waiting. Michael Grant raised a hand. "Given the circumstances," he said carefully, "we're going to pause this meeting." I could feel every eye in the room on me now. Pity, suspicion, irritation. As the officer closed the door behind them, one thought cut through the noise in my head with terrifying clarity. Whatever Brooke had done to my medical records had followed me here. I hadn't planned to hand my life over to my sister. It happened quietly, the way most bad decisions do, wrapped in good intentions and family pressure. When I drove back to Raleigh 3 months earlier, it was a Tuesday afternoon in early March, gray and damp. The kind of day that made the house feel smaller than it really was. My father, Thomas Hayes, was already weak by then. He slept more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was often to ask where Brooke was. She had moved back, first rearranged her life, or at least that's how everyone told it. Brooke met me at the door that day with a hug that lingered just a second too long. "You look exhausted," she said, loud enough for our mother to hear from the kitchen. "You really shouldn't be driving in your condition." I remember thinking she sounded concerned. Reasonable, helpful. My autoimmune symptoms had been flaring since the winter. Fatigue that felt like walking through water. A fog that made it hard to track conversations when too many people were talking at once. I was still working remotely from Minneapolis, still paying my own bills, still managing my care. But next to Brooke's constant motion, her list, her calendars, her phone glued to her hand. I looked slow, uncertain. At dinner that night, Brooke slid a folder across the table toward my mother. "I talked to Dad's doctors today," she said, "just to make sure everyone's on the same page. They said it helps if one person coordinates communication." My mother's shoulders relaxed immediately. "Thank God," she said. "This is all so overwhelming. I should have spoken up then. I should have said I was capable of making my own calls, of understanding my own condition. Instead, I stayed quiet. I told myself it was temporary, that this wasn't the hill to die on." Over the next week, Brooke took on more. She scheduled appointments, she answered calls, she insisted it was easier if the hospital had one primary contact, especially since Lauren's health has been unpredictable. Unpredictable. That word started to follow me through the house. When a nurse called while I was resting upstairs, Brooke answered. When paperwork arrived, Brooke opened it. She asked me to sign a few forms, explaining them quickly, her finger already pointing to the next line before I finished reading the first. "It's just standard," she said once when I hesitated. "So I can help you if you're not feeling well," I signed. Family began to treat Brooke like the authority. Relatives called her for updates. My aunt praised her sacrifice. Someone joked that Brooke should go into healthcare, she was so good at managing everything. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, I became the problem to be managed. If I looked tired, it was proof. If I went to lie down, it was concern. If I questioned something, it was brushed off as stress. My mother started asking Brooke before asking me. Brooke answered before I finished sentences. "She's just not herself right now," Brooke would say gently. A hand on my arm. Her grip firm enough to remind me not to push. I told myself she was helping our father. I told myself this was what families did in a crisis. I told myself that once things settled, I'd take my life back. But there was a moment late one evening when I stood in the hallway and watched Brooke on the phone speaking in a low, confident voice, nodding as if the person on the other end could see her. She glanced up, saw me watching, and smiled. "I've got it handled," she said. "You should rest." And I did. I rested while she learned how much power came with being believed. I didn't go looking for proof. I was just trying to understand why people had started talking to me differently. It was a Thursday evening, late March, after dinner had been cleared, and my mother had gone upstairs early. Brooke was out running one of the many errands she'd begun to collect like badges of honor. The house was quiet in a way that made it easier to hear your own thoughts, which wasn't always a good thing. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and logged into my patient portal, the same one I'd used for years. It had always been a neutral place. Numbers, dates, lab results, something solid to hold on to when my body felt unreliable. The first thing I noticed was a message marked reviewed. I didn't remember opening it before. It was a visit summary from an appointment earlier that month, one I vaguely recalled because I left feeling dismissed. At the time, I'd blamed myself for not explaining things clearly. Now reading it again, my stomach tightened. The note said I had acknowledged heightened stress related to anticipated inheritance and had admitted that symptoms may be exaggerated during periods of emotional distress. It went on to describe me as inconsistent in reporting and potentially motivated by secondary gain. I stared at the screen, reading the sentences over and over, waiting for recognition to set in. It didn't. I had never said those words. Not to that doctor, not to anyone. I scrolled further, hoping to find context, something that would make it make sense. Instead, I found more of the same. Language that sounded clinical but felt personal. Conclusions I didn't remember anyone reaching out loud. The next morning when I went in for blood work, The phlebotomist avoided eye contact. The nurse spoke slowly, carefully, as if I might misunderstand. When I asked a question about follow-up, she said, "The doctor will decide what's necessary," in a tone that made it clear the decision wasn't mine anymore. I left the clinic with a familiar ache in my joints and a new sharper one in my chest. That afternoon, I checked the portal again. This time, I noticed a section I hadn't paid attention to before: authorized contacts. Brooke's name was listed. I clicked into the details, my pulse quickening. It showed her as a proxy, someone permitted to discuss my care and receive information. There was a date next to it, recent, and a digital signature attached. I didn't remember signing anything like that. When Brooke got home, I waited until we were alone in the living room. I kept my voice steady, casual, like I was asking about groceries. "Did I give you access to my medical account?" I asked. She looked genuinely surprised. Offended even. "Of course you did," she said. "Remember? You were exhausted. You said you wanted help keeping track of things." "I don't remember signing anything," I said. She sighed, the sound heavy with patience. "Lauren, you've been foggy. We talked about this. You can't keep questioning every little thing." I wanted to push, to ask her how she explained the notes, the wording, the assumptions, but I didn't, not yet. That night, I went back into the portal and started reading older visit summaries, comparing language, dates, phrasing. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Before, doctors described symptoms. Now they described character. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a misunderstanding, a shorthand that looked worse than it was. Still, before I closed my laptop, I took screenshots, just in case. I didn't know what I was looking at yet. I only knew that whatever was being written about me didn't sound like me at all. By Monday morning, I knew better than to expect quick answers. It was the first business day after the weekend, and the house was already tense before anyone spoke. My father had slept poorly. My mother moved through the kitchen on autopilot. Brooke was on her phone before she'd finished her coffee, her voice low, efficient, already in charge of someone else's schedule. I waited until she stepped outside to take a call before opening my laptop again. I drafted a message to the clinic through the patient portal, choosing my words carefully. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply asked for clarification. I pointed out language in my recent visit summaries that didn't reflect what I remembered saying. I requested a review and, if necessary, a correction. When I hit send, the confirmation was immediate and impersonal. "Your message has been received. A member of our team will respond within 3 to 5 business days." 3 to 5 business days. I stared at the words longer than I needed to. Later that morning, I called the clinic directly. After navigating a long phone tree, I reached a woman who introduced herself as part of patient relations. Her tone was practice kind without being familiar. She explained the process slowly, as if reading from a script. Medical records couldn't be altered casually. Any amendment required formal review, documentation, sign-off, time. "We take accuracy very seriously," she said, "which means changes can't happen right away." I asked if I could temporarily restrict access to my records. There was a pause. If there's an authorized proxy on file, she said that change would also require documentation. I thanked her and hung up my hands, resting uselessly on the table. That afternoon, a nurse called the house. Brooke answered before I could get up from the couch. "Yes, this is Brooke Hayes," she said. "I'm her sister. I'm listed as her contact." She listened, nodded, and thanked the nurse before hanging up. Then she turned to me with a sympathetic smile. "They're still deciding next steps," she said. "I told them you've been overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. The word landed heavier than it should have. I began to notice how often Brooke spoke for me, how naturally people accepted it. When my aunt stopped by with a casserole, she asked Brooke how I was doing, not me. When a family friend called, he thanked Brooke for handling everything. I tried to reinsert myself gently. I corrected small details. I asked to be included on calls. Each time, Brooke responded the same way, concerned patient, slightly wounded. "I'm just trying to help," she said one evening when I asked her not to answer a medical call on my behalf. "You're not thinking clearly right now." My mother stood at the sink, her back to us, rinsing the same plate again and again. That night, I logged back into the portal and started reading the fine print. Policies, procedures, terms I'd never needed to know before. I learned that records were treated as permanent unless formally challenged, that reviews moved at the pace of committees, not individuals, that once a narrative entered the system, it didn't leave easily. I also learned that the system didn't care who I was. It didn't care that I felt misrepresented. It didn't care that my health depended on being believed. It cared about process, about order, about doing things the right way, even when the right way felt like standing still. Before shutting down my computer, I opened a folder on my desktop and labeled it simply medical. Inside, I saved the screenshots I'd taken, the visit summaries, the proxy authorization page, dates, times. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't even sure what exactly I was up against, but I could feel the walls closing in. And for the first time since I'd come home, I understood that waiting quietly had a cost. I stopped trying to convince anyone and started trying to understand the rules. It was Wednesday, early April, and rain pressed steadily against the windows. Brooke had taken my father to an appointment, leaving the house briefly quiet. I sat at the dining table with my laptop and a legal pad, the folder labeled medical open beside me like something fragile. I went back into the patient portal and clicked where I hadn't before: security settings, access history. The dull administrative corners, no one visits unless they have to. That was where I saw a recovery email address I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. The address had been added weeks earlier. There were timestamps showing password resets I didn't remember requesting. Nothing dramatic. Just enough activity to suggest someone had been inside my account without announcing themselves. My hands were steady this time. I took screenshots. I saved them with dates in the file name. I didn't tell myself what it meant. I just kept going. I called a patient advocacy office in Durham I found through the hospital's website. The woman who returned my message introduced herself as Karen Mills. She didn't rush me. She didn't interrupt. When I finished explaining, she asked careful questions: what I remembered signing, who lived in the house, how communication had been handled. "What you're describing isn't unheard of," she said, "especially when one family member is positioned as a caregiver." She explained the difference between misunderstanding and misrepresentation, between helping and substituting, between access and control. The key, she said, is documentation. Patterns matter more than explanations. After we hung up, I felt something shift. Not relief, not anger, resolve. That evening, Brooke returned with my father and filled the kitchen with updates, appointments, instructions. My mother nodded along, grateful. I listened quieter than usual and noticed something I'd missed before. Brooke spoke with confidence, not because she was right, but because no one challenged her. Later, alone in my room, I opened the folder again. I added the visit summaries where language changed, the proxy authorization page, the access logs. I created a timeline, dates on one side, notes on the other. The pattern began to take shape. The night I signed paperwork without reading it closely, the first dismissive appointment, the proxy access appearing, the shift in tone from medical to moral. It wasn't proof yet, but it was structure. I also wrote down what this had already cost me: delayed care, doctors who no longer met my eyes, family members who spoke about me like I wasn't there. I understood then that silence wasn't neutral, it was permission. I wasn't ready to accuse Brooke. I wasn't even sure how far this went. But I knew I couldn't keep waiting for the system to notice on its own. Before shutting my laptop, I backed everything up to a flash drive and placed it in my purse, not as a weapon, as insurance. When Brooke knocked on my door later asking if I needed anything, I told her I was fine. My voice didn't shake. That was the moment I crossed a line I couldn't step back from. I didn't confront her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stopped participating in the story she was telling for me. And for the first time since coming home, I chose myself quietly. I chose Thursday because it was the first day I could breathe. The rain had cleared overnight, and the morning felt deceptively calm. Brooke had taken my father to another appointment. My mother rode along, and for the first time in weeks, the house was mine alone. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the flash drive in my hand, turning it over like a decision that hadn't yet settled. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't confront Brooke. I followed the process exactly the way Karen Mills had outlined it. I logged into the hospital's compliance portal and filled out the form I'd bookmarked days earlier. Each field forced me to slow down. Dates, locations, names. I described what I knew, not what I suspected. I attached the screenshots, the access logs, the proxy authorization page. I wrote carefully, aware that once this left my hands, it wouldn't belong to me anymore. At the end, there was a checkbox. I certify that the information provided is accurate to the best of my knowledge. I checked it. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, thanking me for my submission and explaining that an internal review would follow. No promises, no timelines, just a case number and a reminder that retaliation, if suspected, should be reported immediately. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. This wasn't revenge. It didn't feel powerful. It felt like stepping off solid ground and hoping there was something underneath. That afternoon, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Ms. Hayes, this is Detective Alan Ruiz with the Raleigh Police Department. I'm calling in reference to a report that's been forwarded to us. My heart started to race, but his tone was measured, procedural. He explained that complaints involving identity misuse and medical documentation sometimes crossed into criminal territory depending on findings. His job, he said, was to ask questions, verify facts, and determine whether further action was warranted. I want to be clear, he added. This doesn't mean charges. It means we look. We spoke for 20 minutes. He asked how access was granted, who lived in the house, whether I'd noticed changes in my care. He didn't speculate. He didn't react when I mentioned my sister. He took notes. When we hung up, I felt smaller than before, but steadier. Brooke noticed the shift immediately. That evening, she cornered me in the hallway, her voice low and tight. Did you call someone? She asked. The clinic mentioned an inquiry. I kept my answer simple. I asked for a review. Her expression hardened for a split second before softening into concern. Lauren, this is exactly what I was worried about, she said. You're escalating things because you're scared. You don't need to do this. My mother stood a few steps away, pretending to organize mail. Brooke stepped closer. People are going to misunderstand, she continued. They're already questioning your stability. Do you really want outside authorities involved? There it was. The warning wrapped as protection. I just want my records to be accurate, I said. She exhaled sharply. You're overreacting. That night, Brooke started locking her phone. She took calls outside. She reminded everyone how fragile I was. Not cruelly, carefully, I didn't respond. I documented. I saved the time Brooke confronted me. I noted the call from the detective. I backed up my files again. This was the cost of crossing the line. Once I did, there was no pretending we were still on the same side. I lay awake long after the house went quiet, listening to the familiar sounds of home that no longer felt safe. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I had stopped being managed. By the following Tuesday, the story no longer belonged to me. I could feel it before anyone said anything outright. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The way people spoke more slowly, carefully, like every word had been pre-approved. Something had shifted, and it wasn't in my favor. It was mid-April, a cool Tuesday morning, when my Aunt Carol stopped by, unannounced. She stood in the kitchen holding a paper coffee cup, eyes fixed on the counter instead of my face. "I thought you should see this," she said, sliding her phone toward me. On the screen was a message thread I didn't recognize. A long paragraph sent from a number saved as Dr. Reynolds explaining that my condition was largely psychosomatic and that I had been advised to reduce stressors including fixation on inheritance outcomes. It was written in confident clinical language. I had never met a Dr. Reynolds. "That's not real," I said, my voice flat. Carol hesitated. "Brooke said it came from one of your doctors. She was worried about you." There it was, the counter move. I spent the rest of the morning making calls. The clinic confirmed there was no Dr. Reynolds associated with my care. They couldn't comment on the message, but they noted my concern. Carefully, neutrally, when Brooke came home that afternoon, she was already defensive. "Why are you calling people?" she asked. "You're confusing everyone." I told her about the message. I watched her face closely. She didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed. "I was trying to help," she said. "People were asking questions. I needed to calm them down." By reframing me, she'd isolated me. Within days, the consequences followed. A referral was delayed. A specialist appointment was pushed back pending clarification. My insurance flagged a claim for review. Nothing was denied outright. Everything slowed. I began to understand the risk I'd taken. Detective Ruiz called again that Thursday. His tone was unchanged, but the questions were sharper. He asked about communications sent in my name, about messages attributed to doctors, about who had access to my phone records. "We're seeing activity that suggests escalation," he said. "That doesn't change the process, but it does affect how we advise you." How I asked. "Document everything," he said, "and limit unnecessary contact." That night, my mother knocked on my door. "You don't have to keep pushing this," she said quietly. "Your father doesn't need more stress." I looked at her and saw how badly she wanted the house to feel normal again, even if normal meant untrue. "I'm not pushing," I said. "I'm responding." Brooke didn't speak to me for 2 days after that. When she did, it was with a careful politeness that felt more dangerous than anger. "I just want you to get better," she said in front of my mother. "All of this is too much for you." I realized then that my plan had underestimated one thing. She wasn't just defending herself. She was rewriting the story faster than I could correct it. So I adjusted. I stopped explaining myself to family. I stopped reacting in real time. I limited what I said and to whom. I funneled everything through email. I saved voicemails. I asked questions in writing. If lies could travel without me, then so could facts. I didn't know how long it would take. I only knew that what was happening now would matter later, and that the cost of staying quiet had finally been replaced by the cost of speaking up. I stopped thinking of the chaos as random once I understood who benefited from it. It was Friday, late April, the morning after my father had another difficult night. He slept through most of the day, his breathing shallow but steady. The house moved quietly around him, as if noise alone might be what finally tipped him over the edge. Brooke took charge of everything: meals. Medications calls her voice calm. Her movements precise. Too precise. I sat in my room with the door closed and replayed the last 2 weeks in my head. Every delay. Every message. Every moment when confusion had worked in someone else's favor. I'd assumed escalation would force clarity. Instead, it had created fog. That was my mistake. Detective Ruiz called just before noon. His tone was the same, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something steadier. "We've completed preliminary verification," he said. "Some of what you flagged checks out. Some doesn't resolve on paper alone." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means timing matters," he said. and context. He explained that internal systems move slowly, but external pressure changed priorities. That when false information began circulating beyond private channels, insurance providers' legal documents, it left a trail that couldn't be ignored. There's a point where patterns become evidence, he said. We're approaching that. After we hung up, I sat very still. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't triumphant. I was focused. That afternoon, my father's attorney, Michael Grant, called to confirm details for the upcoming will reading. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday at his office downtown. He spoke carefully, as if aware that everything surrounding our family now required caution. There's been some concern about capacity and records, he said. I want to make sure everyone feels comfortable with the process. Comfortable. The word felt almost ironic. When I mentioned that law enforcement was reviewing certain documentation, he paused. Just briefly, but enough. Thank you for telling me, he said. That's important. I understood then what I'd missed before. Brooke wasn't just shaping the medical narrative. She was positioning it for what came next. For the will, for credibility, for control. That night while Brooke took a call outside, I opened my folder again. I reorganized it. Not by emotion but by audience. Medical, insurance, legal. Each piece labeled, dated, cross-referenced. I drafted a short factual email to Michael Grant, summarizing the existence of an active review without accusation or detail. Just enough to create awareness, just enough to establish that questions existed before documents were read aloud. I didn't send it right away. Instead, I waited. The next morning, I forwarded the message. Then I emailed Detective Ruiz with the will reading date and location. He replied within the hour. Understood, he wrote. That aligns. For the first time, the pieces began to move in the same direction. Brooke sensed it. She became almost cheerful, talking about Tuesday like a finish line. She spoke confidently about honoring Dad's wishes, about closure, about moving forward. I listened without interrupting. I didn't need to convince her of anything anymore. What mattered now wasn't speed, it was placement. I went to bed that night knowing the system hadn't chosen a side yet, but it had started paying attention. And that, I realized, was how the truth finally got its turn. Brooke chose her moment the way some people choose a seat at church, carefully, publicly, and with the expectation that no one would challenge her. It was Tuesday, early May, a little after 2 p.m, when we gathered in Michael Grant's office downtown. The building was quiet, professional, designed to make grief look orderly. My mother sat beside Brooke, hands folded, eyes rimmed red. I sat across from them, my purse on my lap. The flash drive inside it like a weight I wasn't supposed to mention. Michael Grant opened a folder and began with the formalities. Names, dates, a few sentences about my father, Thomas Hayes, and the legitimacy of the document. His voice was steady, respectful. Brooke couldn't let the quiet last. I just want to say something before this starts, she said, turning slightly so the relatives behind her could see her face. Because I don't want any confusion. She looked at me with the kind of concern that plays well in rooms like this. Lauren's been struggling, she said. She's been telling people things that aren't accurate, and I'm worried it's because she's not well. She's been fixated on the inheritance, and it's made her paranoid. A soft murmur moved through the room. I watched it happen, her words landing, taking shape, becoming fact in the minds of people who wanted an easy explanation. Michael Grant's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, but his hand paused on the papers. Then the door opened. A uniformed officer stepped in first, followed by Detective Alan Ruiz. He looked exactly the same as when he'd called me, calm, contained, not here to perform. Attorney Grant, Ruiz asked. Grant stood. Yes. We're going to need to speak with Brooke Hayes, Ruiz said, and the room went still. Ma'am, please remain seated. Brooke blinked, startled, then laughed lightly. This can't be serious. Ruiz didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply placed a manila folder on the edge of Grant's desk. Over the past month, we've worked with the hospital's compliance department, he said, to verify access activity tied to Ms. Lauren Hayes' medical account. We have confirmed multiple password reset requests linked to a recovery email that was added without her knowledge. Brooke's smile stiffened. Ruiz continued, flipping open the folder to a printed page. We also have documentation showing that proxy authorization was created digitally from a device associated with your phone number. In addition, we've received copies of messages circulating under the name of a physician not affiliated with Ms. Hayes' care. He looked directly at Brooke for the first time. Can you explain that? Brooke's eyes darted to my mother. Diane's face had gone pale, the blood draining out as if she'd been expecting this without admitting it to herself. I don't know what you're talking about, Brooke said quickly. I was helping. She asked me to. She's confused. Ruiz lifted a hand, not harshly, just enough to slow her down. We're not asking for interpretations, he said. We're asking for facts. We need your phone for review. Brooke's hand tightened around her handbag. No, absolutely not. That refusal hung in the air like a confession. The uniformed officer stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, we can do this voluntarily, or we can seek a warrant. Brooke stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. This is ridiculous. She did this. She's trying to punish me because Dad didn't. She stopped herself too late. The sentence had already exposed the motive she'd worked so hard to hide. Michael Grant spoke for the first time since Brooke started. Ms. Hayes, he said quietly. I'm going to pause this proceeding. Brooke looked around the room as if searching for the audience she'd counted on. The relatives avoided her eyes. My mother stared at the floor. No one moved to protect her. Ruiz remained steady. Brooke Hayes, he said, you are not under arrest at this moment, but you are required to cooperate with an investigation. Please step outside with us. As the officer opened the door, Brooke turned toward me, breathless, furious. For a month, she'd tried to make my body the evidence that I was lying. Now the evidence was paper timestamps and a badge. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, the room stopped believing her. Justice didn't arrive all at once. It came in paperwork, quiet meetings, and decisions made in rooms I never entered. It was the second Friday in May, when Detective Ruiz called to tell me the investigation had formally concluded. The findings were clear enough to be forwarded to the district attorney: unauthorized access, identity misuse, fabrication of medical communications. There would be charges, he said, and while the process would take time, the outcome was no longer uncertain. I thanked him and hung up, then sat alone at the kitchen table long after the call ended. I didn't feel victorious. I felt emptied out, as if something heavy I'd been carrying had finally been set down. The will was read the following Monday, this time without interruption. Michael Grant handled it with the same careful neutrality, but the room felt different. Smaller, quieter. My father's wishes were honored exactly as he'd written them. There were no surprises, no grand gestures, just clarity, the kind that settles arguments before they can start. Brooke wasn't there. Her absence was loud, but no one mentioned it. Afterward, my mother asked if we could talk. We sat in her car in the parking lot, the windows rolled down, the spring air cool between us. She didn't defend Brooke. She didn't excuse herself. She just said she was sorry she hadn't listened sooner. I wanted everything to stay intact, she said. I didn't realize what it was costing you. I told her the truth. That some things couldn't be repaired quickly. That trust didn't reset just because the facts were now public. But I also told her I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. The most tangible change came weeks later when the hospital completed its review. My medical records were formally amended. Language was corrected. Unauthorized notes removed. My care resumed with a new provider who spoke to me like a person, not a problem. It felt strangely emotional to read my own story in words that finally matched my experience. I moved back to Minneapolis at the start of June. I returned to my routine slowly, deliberately. Work, appointments, evenings that belonged to no one but me. I kept the flash drive for a while, then eventually locked it away in a drawer I rarely opened. I didn't need to look at it anymore. Healing, I learned, wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been handed over too easily. I didn't rebuild my life dramatically. I rebuilt it honestly, and that was enough. If you've ever felt silenced by family or dismissed by systems that were supposed to protect you, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if the story stayed with you, consider following along for more like it. Sometimes the next chapter is where clarity finally begins.